عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا لأبي عبد الله الحسين وأولاده وصحبه. May God continue to reward us and increase us in our commemoration of Imam Hussein and his family and his companions. May God reward and increase our elders who passed this commemoration down to us. And they did it because they recognized it was something of value. So, of course, I will be having the privilege of addressing you later. I just wanted to say a few words to begin with. They considered this commemoration to be of value. So what do I mean by that? They consider it to be a value because, for example, when any of our loved ones passes away, we convene a majlis for Imam Hussein. We don't condole our own ones, but we condole his mother. And of course, the reason why we do this is because his story is our story. His story is our story because it is dear to us. The Prophet, in his last sermons, one of the phrases he repeated, both in his final Hajj and also on the plains of Ghadir, he asked the people, his companions, he said, "Am I not dearer to you than you yourselves?" So the Prophet and the Ahlulbayt are dearer to us than our very selves, which means that it is our story. And this is what we say in the phrase which I start with. We talk about the reward because of the calamity that we have suffered, because of what happened to us. But the message of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt is not just for us insofar as we identify as the Shia of Ali or Muslims. This is definitely a message for us, and it's what we do. But it's also a story and a message for everyone. In the phrase of the ziyarat, it says that may God reward us not just for our musibah, our calamity, but for the calamity of the peoples of the heavens and the earth. The entirety of creation has suffered loss with what happened to Imam Hussein and his family. And it's our duty, of those who know about this, to tell our story to those who are not familiar, so that they can connect with what is their story. It is very much the ultimate story of us as a common humanity. We will begin the poetry this evening. I will hand the mic to my brother, Sayyid Ali Naqvi, in Leeds, who will recite a poem in commemoration of the Imam and his Ahlul Bayt. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
I have one very short poem and a slightly long one to present to you today. I think it goes to the heart of what we've been handed to us by our ancestors and what we've been told is our commemoration, our understanding of the glory of the Ahlul Bayt and the importance of the Ahlul Bayt. And I often get asked this, and I often get told this by certain brothers, that that Shia and to show you are not within the fold of Islam. So I wrote a response to that question, and then I want to talk about Imam Sajjad as well and what he brings to our understanding of faith and worship. Salawat. The first poem is called Folded. Muslims say to me, what you do is out of the fold of Islam. No matter. I am wrapped in the folds of Suqaina's burning dress, itself folded in dread, while the little body it wraps runs and runs to Kufa, calling for her grandfather, her pleas pursed on her lips. Where were you when Ammu fell? Where was your sword when father fell? I am stretched and scorched with those folds. Let me ask you, Muslim, where were you when those folds were lambent, weeping with me or carrying the flame? Where are the Muslims when her father calls? Salawat. Muhammad. The second poem I have here is a meditation on the greatness of Imam Sajjad, and we call him Zain al-Abidin, the zenith, the ultimate example of those who worship. And I want you to think about his experience and his suffering and how he turned that into the Saif al-Sajidiyya and the kind of advice and the imamate, the example of leadership that he gives us. They say he never slept, always supplicating and seeking, and when given water, wept, always ruminating and reliving. There are limits to our imagination where the spirit can no longer will itself into meditation, where one cannot hear the scrape of rusty hinges and the smell and smell the salt in your tears, and thus only exist on the fringes of the Sajjadiyya at that moment. Or to have a shadow's glance of the great nafs tested by his call, of the thrall collar, the manacled hands, while watching blow after blow fall on the shoulders that drew him to stand. Nightmares cannot ferment the fear, the despair, as his paper frame crumples at Suqaina's janazah, and cannot hear the sobs as the tyrant tramples on those beloved lips that whispered their last salams as he lay stricken, bent by the chaos and by anguish withered. If we had an inkling of that fear, we would have raged, while our throats rasped with dry cries of madness, ashamed at our weakness, embittered maybe at the Creator. But such is the Sajjadiyya, that Sajjad is transformed into submission. His broken bones hurl themselves down, and the nafs that is certain gives certainty, and the nafs that is mercy becomes mercy, and those shackled hands make mercy flow. Such is the Sajjadiyya, that when worship wants for itself a zenith, it looks for Sajjad. When attainment wishes to rise, it asks Sajjad to give itself flight. Men raise themselves taller, but Sajjad hunkers in whispered prayers, showing that giving all is gaining all. Salawat.
So as we have been doing, we will continue with Source Khani from Lucknow. So I will pass the mic to Askari Naqvi in Lucknow, who will present the Source Khani. Askari.
शुक्रिया सज्जाद, बहुत शुक्रिया। आदाब हाजरीन। सज्जाद बेहद अफसोस है आपके चाचा का इंतकाल का, और बहुत हमारी तरफ से कंडोलेंसेस आपके लिए। हाजरीन, कल हमने सोसखानी में जो आस का इस्तेमाल है उस बारे में आपसे बात की थी। थोड़ी सी बात अब मैं आज आपसे करना चाहूँगा, किस तरह से एक ट्रेजेडी जो अरब में गुजरी, यानी करबला का जो वाक़या अरब में गुजरा, उसको किस तरह से हिंदुस्तान ने और ख़ास तौर से अवध ने अडेप्ट किया, उस बारे में कि हुआ क्या कि जब वो कहानी, वो वाक़या, जो जो ट्रेजेडी वहाँ से जब हिंदुस्तान पहुँची, तो उस वक्त उसको इस अंदाज से पेश किया जाना शुरू कर दिया। मीर अनीस ने पेश किया, तमाम और शायरों ने उसको पेश किया। एक तो हिंदुस्तानी म्यूज़िक के साथ, हिंदुस्तानी शास्त्रीय संगीत के साथ उसको मिलाया गया, और दूसरा ज़बानों के साथ उसको मिलाया गया। आज मैं जो एक कलाम आपके सामने पेश करूंगा, जिसमें आप उसका एक नमूना भी देखेंगे किस तरह से हिंदुस्तानी ज़बान, जिसमें अवधी एक ज़बान है, उसमें उसको इस तरह से पेश किया गया कि बिल्कुल मालूम ये होने लगे कि आपके आसपास का, आपके अपने इलाके का वाक़या है। नाज़रीन, गम हुसैन बहुत बड़ा गम है। हर गम को उसके साथ जोड़ा जा सकता है, हर गम को उसके साथ मनाया जा सकता है, लेकिन फिर भी उस गम को बार बार अपने अंदर जज्ब करने के लिए कुछ न कुछ सहारे चाहिए। वो सहारा ज़बान का हो सकता है, वो सहारा अपनी जिस तहज़ीब में आप रहते हैं उस तहज़ीब का हो सकता है। मशहूर मीर अनीस का बंद जो है ना कि संदल से मांग बच्चों से गोदी हरी रहे, बानुए नेक नाम की खेती हरी रहे। उस तरह की बातें जब शुरू हो गई, तब जा कर के हम वहाँ तक पहुँच सके जहाँ हम अपने हर इमोशन को, यानी हमारे अंदर जो इमोशंस हैं, जो मौजूद थे, जिस तहज़ीब में हम पले बढ़े, उससे उसको मिला सकें। और फिर जो आहुजारी है, जो जो ज़ारो क़तार रोने का ट्रेडिशन है, वो बरकरार रहे। और फिर उसके अलावा जो हमारे अपने जो गुज़र गए, चाहे हमारे चचा हों, चाहे हमारे भाई हों, बहन हों, भतीजे हों, भांजे हों, जो भी हादसे गुज़रे या जो तकलीफ़ में हैं, उनकी तकलीफ़ से इस बड़ी तकलीफ़ को जोड़ पाना, ये कमालात हैं ट्रेडिशन ऑफ मुहर्रम के, सोस ख़्वानी के, मरसिया ख़्वानी के, ख़िताबत के या नौहा ख़्वानी के। तो बस इतनी सी बात। और अब मैं आपके सामने एक सोज़ जो कि राग देश में बंधा है पेश करूंगा। अवधी ज़बान में है। जब जूझन को गयो कासिम जी, हज़रत कासिम की शहादत है। जब मैदान में जब जूझन को गयो कासिम जी, घमसान की ओर रनमा डट के। तो मुलाहिज़ा फरमाइएगा। जब जूझन को जब जूझन को गयो कासिम जी, घमसान कियो रनमा डटके। जब जूझन को गयो कासिम जी, घमसान कियो रनमा डट के। और बैरी मार भगाए दियो जरा हट के और बैरी मार भगाए दियो पग पाछे धर्यो ना जरा हट के जब जूझन को तलवारन से तन चूर भयो पाग के पेच गिरे कट के तलवारन से तन चूर भयो पाग के पेच गिरे कट के और मुखड़े पर लहरावत हैं और मुखड़े पर बिखरे लहरावत हैं सब लोग कहें सहरा लटके जब जूझन को गयो कासिम जी घमसान कियो रनमा डट के जब जूझन को आदाब। नाज़रीन, अब इमाम हुसैन के शान में एक सोज पेश कर रहा हूँ। फजाइल का सोज है कि राग भैरवी में बंधा हुआ वो सलाम लिखिए हुसैन पर वो सलाम लिखिए हुसैन पर कि बहिश्त जिसका सिला मिले वो सलाम लिखिए हुसैन पर कि बहिश्त जिसका सिला मिले। और ये तलब तो अपनी तरफ से है उधर से देखिए क्या मिले। ये तलब तो अपनी तरफ से है उधर से देखिए क्या मिले। और जो दरे हुसैन पे हो मकी वो जरूर पहुँचे अली तलक जो दरे हुसैन पे हो मकी वो जरूर पहुँचे अली तलक। और जो अली मिले तो नबी मिले, और जो नबी मिले तो खुदा मिले। वो सलाम लिखिए हुसैन पर कि बहिश्त जिसका सिला मिले। शुक्रिया, आदाब। बस आखिर में एक सलाम मीर अनीस का। हुसैन यूं हुए है मुजरई वतन से जुदा कि जैसे बुलबुले नाशाद हों चमन से जुदा। राग झंझोटी में बंधा हुआ ये सलाम पेश खिदमत है। हुसैन यूं हुए मुजरई वतन से जुदा। हुसैन यूं हुए मुजरई वतन से जुदा कि जैसे बुलबुले नाशाद हों चमन से जुदा। हुसैन यूं हुए आए सकीना मर गई सकीना मर गई कैदे सितम में घुट घुट के सकीना मर गई कैदे सितम में घुट घुट के मगर न चांद सी गर्दन हुई रसन से जुदा। हुसैन यूं हुए ए मुजरई वतन से जुदा। शेर देखिएगा हाजरीन। हुसैन यूं हुए उस सिपाहे शाम से निकला जो हुर तो बोले मलक सिपाहे शाम से निकला जो हुर तो बोले मलक, अरे लो आफताबे दरख्शां हुआ गहन से जुदा हुसैन यूं हुए मुजरई वतन से जुदा। उस सफर से आए सफर से फिर के वतन को न जीते जी आए, सफर से फिर के न वतन को जीते जी आए। जब घड़ी थी कि अकबर हुए बहन से जुदा हुसैन यूं हुए मुजरई वतन से जुदा। मतले का शेर, मख्ते का शेर हाजिर कर रहा हूं। हुसैन यूं हुए फिशार कब्र का, गर खौफ है तुझे तो अनीस, फिशार कब्र का गर खौफ है तुझे तो अनीस, और रहे न सुर्रे खाके शिफा कफन से जुदा हुसैन यूं हुए मुजरई वतन से जुदा। आदाब, बहुत शुक्रिया। ओवर टू यू सज्जाद।
Allahumma
सल्लल्लाहु
ala
अलैहि मोहम्मद।
Muhammadin ajrakum ala Zahra। इंशाल्लाह फिर कल शब फिर से अस्करी भाई सूसखानी पेश करेंगे। Before I start my address, please join me in reciting Surah Al-Fatiha for all of our marhumin, especially those who have passed away from COVID, but also for those who continue to be afflicted by COVID. Fatiha. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله وأهل بيتك المظلومين. صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله الآخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين ويا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الصادق من آل محمد: هل الدين إلا الحب؟ أو هل الإيمان إلا الحب؟ One of the key elements of the message of the Prophet, of the purpose of Islam, as we know from the words of the Prophet himself, is the perfection of character. It's to make us aware of what our moral obligations are, what moral agency is, and how it is that we should fulfill the duties that we have to one another. How it is that ethics becomes a sphere of what it is that we owe one another. And particularly within this context, we have plenty of narrations about the role of love. That love is the very core, it's the end, it's the telos, it's the goal of the faith as well. Because through that moral perfection, that perfection of character, that transformation and purification of the self, that implementing of the moral psychology, that we perfect ourselves in such a way that we are both worthy of love and we can be ones who love both one another and of course that we can reciprocate and love God. And this ethical imperative is in many ways even more important in these days. What the time or the age of COVID presents before us is precisely the way in which the care for the self and the care for the other, the compassion for oneself and the compassion for one another becomes the core purpose of our continuing existence. Because quite simply, without that, we will not survive. The way a pandemic works precisely is that it accelerates a disease and its transmission through contact, through careless contact. Sometimes, of course, that contact is with loved ones and you want to, you ache to meet them and to touch them. But in such a context, care for the self and care for the other also involves a certain distance and a caution, being aware of what the consequences are of what we do and of our actions and our interactions with others. Inshallah, of course, we pray that the time returns where we don't have these sorts of restrictions. But as I said before, these restrictions do provide us with opportunities. It provides us with opportunities precisely like this majlis online, reaching a wider, a different virtual community, a virtual community which is both watching now and participating now, but also one which will participate later, because that is one of the features of what we can do through this particular medium of YouTube. So that's a very important result of the possibilities of the present. So at the heart, as I said, of the age of COVID is this ethical imperative. Now, what I want to do is to examine this question of the ethical imperative with respect to the two elements of the theme that we have chosen for this series of Majlis, the theme of Walaya and the theme of Aza. And what I will do is I will begin with Aza, and then I will move to Walaya, and then I will come back to show how one influences and feeds upon the other and produces a beautiful ethical result in what both Aza constitute and what Walaya is and demands of us. So let us start with Aza. There are two elements here which I want to discuss. The first is what Aza constitutes as a commemoration. As a commemoration, it is a response. It is a response precisely to the Prophet's call when he said, "Am I not dearer to you than yourselves?" And so our commemoration of what happened to his loved ones becomes a commemoration of what is dear to us and is very closely felt to us. It represents the moral agency of what we owe the Prophet and his Ahlulbayt. In one sense, everything that we do in life is a moral response. If one thinks very briefly in a theological sense, and one finds these discussions in works of theology in particular, then each one of us, once we are in the initial stage of recognition and consent to the fact that God exists and that God is a creator and a sustainer of the cosmos, and we are God's, and to her we will be constantly returning. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Once we have acknowledged this, then we take on what in the language of theology is known as taklif. Taklif is moral obligation. The fact that we have been given life and that we are sustained by God and we are given all these bounties by God and that we will meet and arrive at God in the culmination of our span of life means that we have received gifts, we have received bounties. And theologically, it's considered to be a rational imperative that if someone gives you a gift, you should reciprocate. You should be thankful. The phrase in theological works is shukr al-mun'im, thanking the benefactor, thanking someone who has given you ni'mat. Ni'mah has given you a bounty, has given you a gift. And that process of thanking the benefactor, thanking God, is known as taklif, as moral obligation. And this is constituted by the totality of everything that we do as acts of worship. Ultimately, worship is the way in which we thank God. But by worship here, I don't just mean the particularities of ibadat as we see them. things like prayer and fasting and hajj and giving charity and zakat and khums and so forth. But rather, ibadat is the totality of the submission and the thanking of God, which is not just what we owe her, what we owe God, but also what we owe one another. That we render the rights that God has over us because of those gifts. And we also recognize as acts of worship all the totality of our social engagements and interactions. So every act of engaging with our fellow person becomes an act of worship, because in that we are rendering to them what is due to them, what rights they have over us. Now, of course, to a certain extent, one could say that, quite simply, given the enormity of the gifts that God has given us, we cannot entirely be thankful to those gifts. We cannot truly do justice to that. Well, we can make an effort from ourselves. But it is God herself who also facilitates our ability to be thankful. And this is done through another concept which is used in theological works, known as lutf. Lutf is God's grace upon us. It is the ways in which He helps us to fulfill what is due to Him in the way in which He wishes that to be done. And of course, He famously does this in two ways. One is by the provision of guidance. Provision of guidance in the person of the Prophet and the awliya, who are sent by him to guide us, to help us fulfill our moral obligations, to understand that these things that we perhaps sometimes see as ritual practices, or perhaps even as secular social comportment, are actually ways in which we are thanking God, and that we can effect the grace to make sure that we thank God more appropriately. Another way, of course, that He facilitates this process is by giving us intellect so that we have an understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And of course, by making us ponder upon the creation, upon the cosmos, so that we can understand that all the totality of this, both our internal intellects as acts of guidance, as signs of the divine, are similarly ways of guiding us and giving us grace so that we can fulfill our ability to thank God in the same way as the cosmos is. The entirety of this is a set of signs of God. The Prophet is the ultimate sign of God. The Ahlulbayt are perfect signs of God. We ourselves are signs of God. Other humans are signs of God. Our intellects are signs of God. The creation, nature, what we see, the beauty that we see around us is all an aspect of the signs of God which are present for us. And so what then we understand is that at one level, the performance, the commemoration of Aza is a way in which we are thanking those who have given us gifts. And within that, of course, is the Prophet, particularly. The Prophet, as an act of grace, he has done so much for us. He has brought that message. He has purified our souls. He has, as the Quranic verse says, he has brought to us the Quran. He has narrated the Quran. He has given us wisdom. And he has perfected the souls of the believers, purified the souls of the believers. And so how can we not affect our own moral agency in response to his gifts to us by performing the azan. So at one level, azan is a very simple, very, in some ways, humble effort on our part to thank the Prophet and the Ahlulbayt. And again, just as we cannot truly thank God in the way that it does justice, we cannot truly thank the Prophet and the Ahlulbayt in a way that fully does justice as well. There is another way in which azan helps to revive, to enliven our moral agency. And that is through the aesthetics of our commemoration. Throughout this Ashra, we have been listening to Sozkhani, and Sozkhani and the poetry is a way in which our hearts become alive. The aesthetic has an affective impact, which means that it affects the way in which we experience life. Our emotions work. It strikes our heart. And it helps us to understand what moral agency is, and it helps to make us receptive to the possibilities of moral agency. That receptivity comes about through the only thing that we are required of in the azan, as we know from the many narrations of the Imams. And that only one singular thing which is required is crying for Imam Hussein and his family. It is the act of weeping. And we know from many of our experiences in life that crying has a greatly cathartic and comforting effect upon us. It relieves the soul. It gives comfort. It acts as a way for us to polish the mirror of our hearts. It acts as a way of softening our hearts as well. The tears wash away the rust that accrues in our hearts. It softens our hearts. It makes us soft-hearted and not hard-hearted. When we are soft-hearted, we are much more capable of receiving messages. We are much more capable of understanding and appreciating and internalizing when people give us good advice, when people tell us moral tales, exemplary tales, which help us to be better people. So at that level, the azan has a very important moral effect. It helps to revive and enliven and give meaning to our moral agency. Now, in many ways, what I'm saying perhaps seems a bit strange. People don't normally look at the act of prayer, the act of smiling at a person, the act of collecting together for these majalis as acts of moral agency. But at the fundamental core there are. Because one thing which is very clear, and it's clear from that initial statement, that qawl of the Prophet that I mentioned, our very being, our very essence as humans is that we are moral beings. And it is that path, that moral path to being better, which is central to us. And as I mentioned in my earlier comments as well, it's very important that we understand that that message is not one which should be narrowly guarded selfishly for ourselves, those who describe themselves as Shia or Muslims, but rather that should be for everyone. The azan has a cathartic and effective effect on us. It allows us to appreciate morality and moral values. And that effect is open for everyone. It is not just something that we should keep to ourselves, but we should share it with the world. we should be proud that we share this with the world. And as I said before as well, we should be proud of saying that this is our collective story. This is not just a marginal story. This is not just a historical occurrence in the 7th century. It is a universal human story. And at that level, it is one which will strike at the heart of every free thinking, living human who has a soft and receptive heart. And it is our duty to make sure that we can convey that. Now, let me turn to the second element of what I wish to talk about, and that is the walaya. And in some ways, what I'm going to actually do here is derive the notion of moral agency, which in a sense I have already been doing, from facts of ontology. So I'm deriving things that we ought to do and what we owe each other from the way things are, the way things are. Now, as we know, walaya is a particular status. It's a status which, of course, God possesses as well. You know, God is described as the wali, the guardian, the friend, the custodian, the intimate one. Wali also means someone who is very close to you. There are three elements then of walaya. There is the closeness, the intimacy. There is the idea of guardianship and custodianship. And there is the sense of governance, right? Governance and authority over self and over you. And actually, in yesterday's Majlis with Sheikh Nuru, he already covered a lot of those elements which were there. But let me focus on some aspects of it. What are these features of walaya which are important, which come from God down to the Prophet and to his Ahlulbayt? And there are different features of that which I want to mention. But here I will take recourse from a saying of our Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, when he is in the court of Yazid. Now, I'm not going to Masayib now, but I will just give you this one sentence. He says, and this is about what is special about the Ahlulbayt. What are the characteristics, the qualities that they possess? And he says that we have been privileged with knowledge, ilm. We have been privileged with hilm. Hilm is this idea of wisdom, of being able to understand the situation, of forbearance, of judgment, of perspicacity. We have been given shuja'a, courage. We have been given samaha, tolerance, the ability to be tolerant, to be lenient with people, to be lenient with ourselves. We have been given love, mahabba, so much so that we are the objects of love. And in particular, that we have been given love that has been placed, that finds its true place in the hearts of the mu'mineen. That is our, these are our special qualities, our characteristics. This is something that God has given the Ahlulbayt. And this is something that no one can deny truthfully. These are not things that you can force. So, for example, things like, as the last phrase of love, which is placed in the hearts of believers, this is not something that can be forced. It has to be a free act. Love is always an act of freedom. It is not an act of coercion. You cannot place the love of someone in you cannot place, for example, your love in someone else's heart forcibly. It just cannot be done. It has to be a free act. And so that reflects some of the key elements of what walaya is. The ilm, the special knowledge that the imams have. The hilm, the judicious way in which the world is understood, the situations understood. Wisdom and judgment with that, love that people have for them, and the way in which they deal with people with softness, with tolerance, and with leniency. Above and beyond that, of course, we know that the Imams and the Prophet are, as acts of divine grace, give us guidance. And one of the ways in which, there are two ways in which, at least two ways, I mean, they're probably like, we could talk about 70 or 100 ways in which they give us guidance. But let me just mention two. One is precisely by the ways in which they help us to fulfill our moral obligation and be thankful to the benefactor by telling us, for example, what is halal and haram, how we should comport ourselves with respect to God and with respect to each other. But there is also another way in which they provide guidance. They act as the hujjah. They act as a proof of God. They manifest the divine. As Sheikh Kumail said the other day, they manifest the totality of the divine names. Without the Prophet and the Ahlulbayt, we cannot begin to understand God. God in and of herself, himself, is utterly unknown. The only ways in which we can know God is through the means that he, she provides for us. And the fundamental way is through the Ahlul Bayt who manifest the divine names. If we want to understand what it means for God to be wrathful, to be merciful, to be loving, to be intimately loving, to be forgiving, all of these attributes, all of these names, actually, I should say, these names that are used in the Quran to describe God, the ways in which we understand this is precisely from Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt. If we want to understand both the Jalal and the Jamal, the majesty and the beauty of God, we understand it through these individuals. And the ultimate expressions of the Jamal and the Jalal, we find, of course, in the events of Karbala itself. This is precisely why Sayyidah Zainab Salamullahi alayha famously said when she was asked by Yazid, when he mocked her and said, you know, what do you think of what God has done to your brother and his companions? And she said, Ma ra'aytu illa jamila. I saw nothing but what was beautiful. It was the Jamal of God, Jamal of the divine countenance bloodied on the plains of Karbala, which was clear for everyone to see. Now, these elements of the walaya that the Ahlul Bayt and the Prophet possess require certain responses from us. They require recognition, and they help us to see what our obligations are. So the first instance, we are required to at least recognize these facts. We are required to recognize that the Imams have special knowledge, which is divinely given. We have to recognize the ways in which they provide guidance. We can only follow their guidance if we recognize that what they're providing is in fact truly guidance. And we can only follow them and understand the nature of God, the way in which they manifest God, if we recognize that they are the Hujjaj Allah, they are the Asma al-Husna. So the first kind of ethical response that Walaya demands of us is this recognition of Walaya and the various facets of Walaya that the Ahlulbayt have. And then the second one is that it requires us to then understand what it is that we owe God. After all, the Ahlulbayt are signs of, they are the countenance of the divine. They are not the divine herself. They point us towards the divine. And so they help us to understand what it is that we owe God. And again, we should be thinking a bit more broadly than what we owe God is merely the obligations that we have in terms of our ritual practice. There is much more that we owe God. We can't even begin to fulfill that. Every single thing we do, every word that we help someone else utter, every way of helping one another, every smile, as I said, every act of generosity, every ability and element of comforting one another. These are all ways in which we are owing what we owe to God. And the third element is, in terms of the ethical response, is that it helps us to understand what we owe one another. In the first instance, what we owe one another are part of this Ahl al-Walaya, Ahl al-Wilaya.
Brother Kumar, you wanna?
I'm back. Can you see me?
Okay, yeah, we can.
I'm sorry. I think my Wi-Fi has been very bad today. Apologies for that.
No problem.
So I was talking about the third response. The third response that we have to Walaya is what we owe one another, right? So that's precisely where we return to these ethical imperatives. We started with Aza as affecting two aspects of moral agency, the very fact of what we owe to the Prophet and to his daughter, and the way in which it helps us to understand moral agency by reminding us of the examples of those who went before, what happened to the Imam and his followers. Then we moved on to Walaya and the elements of that, and I tried to show how that involves these three sets of responses that we should have with respect to our moral agency. And this is something which lies at the very heart of what happens in Karbala and what happens afterwards. It is in many ways a cosmic moral drama. There are the core values that we espouse, that the Imam espouses, of generosity, of love, of compassion, of mercy, of altruism. We see all of these being manifest. But of course, the reason why we cry is precisely because those who should have accepted this, those who call themselves the community of the Prophet, did not afford the family of the Prophet that recognition. And it's particularly this issue of recognition I want to deal with. And its associated issue of the question of dignity, of respect, and humiliation. Those who fought the Imam did not afford him the recognition that he was the wali of God. They thought that by the way in which they killed him and his companions, the way in which they beheaded them and lifted their heads upon the spears, the way in which they trampled their bodies on the sands of Karbala, that they were humiliating the Imam. They did not afford him the recognition. And then, as we know, they took the family of the Prophet as prisoner. They tied their hands to their necks with ropes. They took the infirm Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin in chains to Kufa and to Sham. And this act of what they thought they were doing, of humiliating them, was precisely their failure, their moral failure. But it was not a humiliation, because they could never humiliate the Prophet's family. It is they who are now humiliated. The function of the Aza is to actually show the humiliation of Yazid and his forces, and not that of the family of the Prophet. When this caravan of captives was taken to Damascus, in particular, the Yazid and his friends made merry. They celebrated what they had done to the Imam and his followers. And they mocked and treated the family with disdain. The words of the Maqtal say, put in the mouths of one of the daughters of the Imam, this famous phrase where she says, Yazid, you are laughing and being joyful, but the daughters of the Prophet are prisoners before you. They are in ropes and chains and binds before you. Sayyidah Zainab, in her famous khutbah, she starts by saying, you think that by dragging us as captives from Karbala to here, you have humiliated us? But don't forget, this is not a humiliation for us. Suffering and shahada are a dignity for us. They are karama for us. You cannot possibly humiliate us. You cannot humiliate those who God has dignified. And I want to end with the famous words of Imam Sajjad. We know that another element of the way in which Yazid tried to humiliate the Ahlulbayt in his court in Damascus was that he called someone to ascend the pulpit and to abuse the grandfather of Imam Sajjad, abuse Imam Hussein and the family, and to praise Yazid. And famously, the Imam at one point lifted his head. He was in his chains and he had kept his head lowered in respect for his aunt and the women of the family. And he said, "Oh preacher, you have earned the wrath of God by pleasing his despicable creation." And then he turns, of course, famously to Yazid and says, "Yazid, do you give me permission to at least ascend the pulpit so I can say something?" And this was about the Imam Sajjad, trying to make people recognize who he was. A lot of false things had been said about the Imam and the Ahlulbayt. And he wanted to enliven in the hearts of the people who were sitting there in Sham who the Ahlulbayt were. What was their station? And so he famously said these words. He ascended the pulpit and he said, "O people, those who know me, but those who do not know me, let me introduce you." And he does not use his name. He says, "I am the son of Makkah and Mina. I am the son of Marwa and Safa. I am the son of Muhammad and Mustafa." And he goes on to recount the virtues of the Prophet as the one who was taken by Buraq up into the heavens to meet his Lord and to come between two bows distance or less. And then he continues and says, "Ana ibn Ali al-Murtada." He says, "Ana ibn Fatimah al-Zahra. Ana ibn Khadijah al-Kubra." And it's important for him also to mention that he is the grandson of Khadijah, the wife of the Prophet, and it was a great grandson. And it was important for him to mention he was a grandson of Fatimah al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, and the one who they thought they were mocking and humiliating the Imam at Karbala by calling him Ibn al-Zahra. But he showed that this was a matter of dignity for them. And then he finally says, I am the son of the one who was killed in oppression and in a brutal manner. I am the one who was beheaded from the back of his neck. I am the one whose head was raised on the lance. And I am the son of the one whose bloodied face and head lie in that tray before you. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. We now go to the Nohafani with Shabir Tijani.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. I just wanted to take your mind to the day of Ashura. It is said that Mullah Hussain alayhi salam picked up body after body, but there was one body that was the hardest for Mullah Hussain to even come near. And that was when his standard bearer, Abul Fadl al-Abbas, left for the battlefield. Mullah Hussain saw this alam from a distance, and as he saw this alam, the alam suddenly veered to the left when Mullah Abbas's right arm was cut, and then veered to the right as his left arm was cut. At this point, the alam stayed straight. As Mullah Abbas held it to his chest, he took the mushk into his teeth, and as the arrow hit the mushk, his heart broke. And as he went towards Furat, a second arrow went and embedded into his eye. Mullah Abbas could no longer sit and get stable on the horse. He fell onto the floor of Karbala, onto the grounds of Karbala. At this point, most people, when they fell from the horse onto the ground, they used their hands. Mullah Abbas fell flat onto his face. Imagine a man who's got an arrow embedded in his eye, how he must have fallen onto the ground of Karbala. He calls his brother, he says, "Oh, my Aqa, come to my aid." Mullah Hussain comes rushing towards the side of Abbas. He puts the head of Abbas in his laps. Mullah Abbas says, "Oh, Aqa, I have one final wish before I leave this world. My mother told me when I was born, I refused to open my eyes until I saw your face for the first time. As I leave this world, Aqa, let me see your face for one final time. Please clean the blood from my eyes." Mullah, in the other eye, I've got an arrow. Mullah Hussain cleans the eyes. Hazrat Abbas says, "Mullah, I wouldn't even give you this trouble had I had my two arms with me." As Mullah Abbas does a ziyarat of his brother, his Aqa, Mullah Hussain says, "Abbas, I have one final wish too." He says, बचपन में तेरा झूला हाथों से झुलाया था, हाथों को तेरे लेकर चलना भी सिखाया था। अब इन हाथों से मैं किस तरह उठाऊंगा बिन बाजो ये लाश तेरी, फरियाद सुनो मेरी एक बार मुझे भाई, कह कर तो बुला गाजी, तीरों के मुसल्ले पर सर को मैं कटाऊंगा, क्या देख सकोगे तुम मैं खून में नहाऊंगा, जख्मी मेरे सीने से हर खून के कतरे से आवाज आएगी, फरियाद सुनो मेरी एक बार मुझे भाई, कह कर तो बुला गाजी। अकबर का कलेजा है नजरों में मेरे भैया, असगर का लहू होगा हाथों में मेरे भैया, मैं किसको पुकारूंगा मैं किसको सदा दूंगा, बतला दो मेरे गाजी, फरियाद सुनो मेरी एक बार मुझे भाई, कह कर तो बुला गाजी। At this point, Mullah Abbas in a very difficult position. This is the imtihan of Abbas. He turns his face towards Medina first as if he's looking towards his mother. He says, Mother, I know I made this promise to you. Since I was born, you raised me for this reason. But mother, my Mawla is asking me now, how can I say no? And then he turns his face towards Najaf. He says, रुख करके नजफ का फिर, रुख करके नजफ का फिर, गाजी ने कहा बाबा अब पास नहीं बाजू, मैं क्या करूं या ज़हरा, मौला है अकेला, करबल में बची है बस शबीर की तन्हाई, सुनकर ये सदा शह की अब्बास का तन तड़पा, जलती हुई रेती पर गाजी का बदन लरजा, कैसे मेरे आका मैं जाऊं दर खैमे पर जब पास नहीं पानी, करबल में तिजानी थी शब्बीर की ये हालात, एक बार कहो भाई पूरी हो मेरी हसरत, अब्बास के होठों से एक बार सदा आई, शब्बीर मेरे भाई, शब्बीर मेरे भाई. I know that every night we try and mix up these languages so that as many of the viewers, as many of the listeners can, those who don't understand certain languages can also partake in your Saudari. I just wanted to recite 2 or 3 verses of a Noha that was originally released in Farsi, but we've adapted it to include a few languages. Inshallah, those of you who know the words, please join our home. Ustad na bardam maidan बर जिस्म हमें आलम जान बर तख्त दलीरी सुल्तान किए अब्बास अज़बाद ये मर्दी सीराब कुर्से कमरे आलम ताब गंजी नोए इश्क नायाब किए अब्बास मसनद दिलावरी रो साहिबे सब शिकाने लश्कर महार पे जंगावारी बिहारी फिस चंकी उस पूरे अली इब्ने अबी तालिब पूरे अली इब्ने अबी तालिब मौला 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 अबल फाज मौला 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 अबल फाज ऐ क़ल्ब अली के अरमान ऐ बाजुए सैयद ज़ीशान हो आप पे ये जा कुर्बान किए अब्बास मैदान में सारे शैतान तुझे देख के होते हैं हैरान ऐ शेर जरिए यज़दां किए अब्बास तुझ पे तो सकीना को नाज है क्योंकि तू वफाओं में फराज है तू तो शेर हैदर का राज है सबके लब पे यही आवाज है सबके लब पे यही आवाज है मौला 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 अबल फाज मौला 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 अबल फाज the mirror image of Haydar the meaning of honor and valor you grant every wish and prayer kiye Abbas the warrior like no other the one that Hussein called brother you'll be in our hearts forever kiye Abbas this is testament to what you gave that the water circles your holy grave if our hearts are troubled and in pain we look to your shrine and call your name we look to your shrine and call your name Mola 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 Abul Faz 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 you were Lady Zainab protector and you were the army's commander you stood as the standard bearer kiye Abbas you mastered the art of combat the whole of Arabia knew that no one had the skills that you had kiye Abbas when you stood against the enemies you broke through their lines with so much ease with the blood of Ali running through your veins sacrificed your two arms for Hussein sacrificed your two arms for Hussein Baine hame ishq dunya ishq astabal faz pure alavi fatah dil ha ishq astabal faz Mola 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 Abul Faz Mola 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 Abul Faz Mola Haq Imam Ya Hassan Ya Hussein Ya Hussein Hussein Ya Hussein Hussein Ya Hussein वो आबिदे बीमार था वो आबिदे बीमार था चलने से जो लाचार था चलने से जो लाचार था और शाम का बाजार था और शाम का बाजार था और मुस्तफा की बेटियां मौला हक इमाम हसन हुसैन मौला हक इमाम हसन Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. As we end, I want you to all join in at home with the promise in your heart and with the yearning of trying to join Imam Hussein by his side. Inshallah, we're going to do ziyarat as soon as possible. Let's say Labbaik Ya Hussein 3 times. Labbaik Ya Hussein. Labbaik Ya Hussein. Labbaik Ya Hussein. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil faraj.
اللهم صل على محمد
محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Let us now move to Sheikh Kumal Wajani, who will recite, because it's Thursday night, Ziyarat Warith. Sheikh Kumal.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا وارث عادم صفوة الله. السلام عليك يا وارث نوح النبي الله. السلام عليك يا وارث إبراهيم خليل الله. السلام عليك يا وارث موسى كليم الله. السلام عليك يا وارث عيسى روح الله. السلام عليك يا وارث محمد حبيب الله. السلام عليك يا وارث علي أمير المؤمنين عليه السلام ولي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن محمد المصطفى. السلام عليك يا ابن علي المرتضى. السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء. السلام عليك يا ابن خديجة الكبرى. السلام عليك يا ثار الله وابن ثاره والوتر الموتور. أشهد أنك قد أقمت الصلاة وأعطيت الزكاة وأمرت بالمعروف ونحيت عن المنكر وأطعت الله ورسوله حتى أتاك اليقين. فلعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به. يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، أشهد أنك كنت نورا في الأصلاب الشامخة والأرحام المطهرة، لم تنجسك الجاهلية بأنجاسها ولم تلبسك من مظلمات ثيابها. وأشهد أنك من دعائم الدين وأركان المؤمنين. وأشهد أنك الإمام البر التقي الرضي الزكي الهادي المهدي. وأشهد أن الأئمة من ولدك كلمة التقوى وأعلام الهدى والعروة الوثقى والحجة على أهل الدنيا. وأشهد الله وملائكته وأنبياءه ورسله أني بكم مؤمن وبيا بكم موقن بشرائع ديني. أني بكم مؤمن وبيا بكم موقن بشرائع ديني وخواتيم عملي. وقلبي لقلبكم سلم وأمري لأمركم متبع. صلوات الله عليكم وعلى أرواحكم وعلى أجسادكم وعلى أجسامكم وعلى شاهدكم وعلى غائبكم وعلى ظاهركم وعلى باطنكم. زيارة علي بن الحسين عليه الصلاة والسلام. السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله. السلام عليك يا ابن نبي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن الحسين الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها المظلوم وابن المظلوم. لعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به. زيارة تمام شهداء كربلاء. السلام عليكم يا أولياء الله وأحباه. السلام عليكم يا أصفياء الله وأبداه. السلام عليكم يا أنصار دين الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار رسول الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار فاطمة سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي محمد الحسن بن علي الولي الناصر. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي عبد الله. بأبي أنتم وأمي طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم ففزتم فوضا عظيما. فيا ليتني كنت معكم فأفوز معكم. زيارة العباس بن علي عليه السلام. السلام عليك يا أبا الفضل العباس ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن سيد الوسيين. السلام عليك يا ابن أول القوم إسلاما وأقدمهم إيمانا وأقومهم بدين الله وأحوتهم على الإسلام. أشهد لقد نصحت لله ولرسوله ولأخيك فنعم الأخ المواسي. فلعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة استحلت منك المحارم وانتهكت حرمة الإسلام. فنعم الأخ الصابر المجاهد المحامي الناصر والأخ الضافي عن أخيه المجيب إلى طاعة ربه الراغب فيما زهد فيه غيره من الثواب الجزيل والثناء الجميل. ولحقق الله بدرجة آبائك في جنات النعيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا أبا الحسن. السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء. السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء. السلام عليك شمس الشموس وانيس النفوس. علي بن موسى الرضا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان. الأمان 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 من فتن الزمان. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. السلام عليك يا بقية الله في أرضه. السلام عليك يا خليفة الله في أرضه. السلام عليك يا إمام زماننا هذا. عجل الله تعالى فرجك الشريف ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
You are mute.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Please join us again tomorrow at 6:30 London time, 1:30 Eastern, 11 o'clock in Lucknow, when our Majlis will be addressed by Sheikh Ja'far Muhibbullah. Until then, of course, please do take care of one another.